So as we can begin, so as I announced last time, what I thought we would do today is, for those of you who are in Europe, to spend more time so we could go a bit past 6, not too much past 6. But what I thought is what we could do is maybe discuss things for about an hour, take a break, 10 minutes, have a cigarette, whatever, and then spend another hour so we could have 2 solid hours, meaning that we could plan staying here till 6:30 at the latest. We have things to do. So that's what we would do today. And then I think the semester is officially over, and I have no idea, roughly. But nonetheless, so even though I've been told that the semester is officially over, for those of you who, again, want to make, I don't know if you've ever seen this film, March or Die. It's not a very good film, but it's about the French Foreign Legion in North Africa. And it's a great film from the 70s. Again, not very good, but great from the 70s. And as the title announces, it's about a bunch of French, Foreign Legion era guys in the Sahara and Libya. They've been abandoned at some fort, and they have to basically march to another fort. And the other fort is many kilometers away. And as the title says, it's about them having to march and get to that fort or die. And of course, they're all dying as they're getting there. So we're going to march or die. So if you're around next week and still have, I guess, both the courage and the inclination, because as you probably noticed, we didn't get through the syllabus as at least it had been conceived. That's how philosophy is. But if those of you who are willing, even though it falls outside the official semester, not next Wednesday, but next Thursday, same time, same place. So I've reserved this room for Thursday from 4 to 6. And there, what I would like to do next week is talk about Rosenzweig, Franz Rosenzweig, which you can read in English. There's a very wonderful edition. It's in the syllabus that I put on the Toledo 2 months ago. A very nice edition by Hackett, very inexpensive, $15, of Rosenzweig's letters during the war, as well as this very important letter that he writes in which the kernel, the core ideas of his, in my opinion, one of the great works of 20th century philosophy, the Star of Redemption, which he basically wrote on postcards that he's sending back to his mother while he's a soldier. He was a German soldier and he served in Macedonia, so it wasn't the intense fighting, of course, of the Western Front, but nonetheless, it was fighting. It's impossible for us to read and discuss the Star of Redemption because it really is it's a really massive and great work. But I still wanted to include Rosenzweig in this class because he's one of the most important German philosophers whose thinking emerges, as he himself says, as a new thinking, the attempt to rethink fundamentally philosophy in the aftermath of the First World War. So I still want to have the opportunity to discuss that with you. Because also it's a very different kind of philosopher, a different kind of perspective on the kind of philosophers we've been doing thus far, like Husserl, etc. So for those of you who are still willing to unofficially keep the class moving, I will be here, so even if it's an empty room, I will take myself and be present. So next Thursday, then what I thought we could do is we could discuss Rosenzweig. So what you should read are these letters. It's a Hackett. It's in the syllabus, philosophical and theological correspondence, and especially what's called in German the Urzelle, so the original cell, this letter that he writes to his friend of his, and I'll talk more about this next week. And at the same time, what we'll do is we'll enter into Rosenzweig, and what I will do is I will start next week by just speaking very briefly about Hermann Cohen. The reason why, as you know, Hermann Cohen's Deutschtum im Judentum is not available in English. So I feel that it makes no sense to say let's dedicate a full class to it because unless you read German or there exists a French translation, I was told, you can't read the text. And unlike Eucken, it's a very sophisticated text, so it's not, either you read it or you don't. So since you can't read it, but actually Hermann Cohen and the text Deutschtum im Judentum is a very important moment in the development of philosophical controversies that emerge in the context of the First World War, in part because of the rise of, or the first manifestation in the First World War at the philosophical level of the anti-Semitism a reaction to that article, as well as I will speak about next week, Herman Cohen is actually the critical figure for Rosenzweig, and I'll get into that both biographically and more forward intellectually. So this is simply to say that the class continues, in a sense, for those of you who are still willing. And not next Wednesday, so that's, and I'll post all of this on Toledo, because you forgot. Not next Wednesday, but next Thursday from 4 to 6. And what we'll do is we'll look really at the reaction of two very important Jewish thinkers, arguably the most important Jewish German philosophers of the 20th century, their reaction to the First World War, and really focus on Rosenzweig and Rosenzweig's core ideas for the book that he would write during the war and publish shortly thereafter, The Star of Redemption. And we'll begin by me just telling you a bit about Herman Cohen, and not only Herman Cohen's Deutsche Judentum, the very important, from a cultural perspective, especially from the cultural demise of anti-Semitism, the very bitter anti-Semitic attack against Herman Cohen, which he did not dignify to respond to. And then we'll launch into then talking about Rosenzweig, and that will also position Rosenzweig, because Rosenzweig is also in a kind of complex, I would call it dialogue, an intellectual reaction to Herman Cohen. As a kind of spiritual father, but the father he wants to reject. So that's what we'll do next week. So that's next week, Thursday. The other thing I just want to announce before we launch into today is, you probably already know since you got that little email about the MOOC starting this week, but all of the lectures of this class have been videoed, and we created a Husserl Archives YouTube channel. And so, if, I don't know, you want to go back to what was being discussed, or over the holidays you're nostalgic for the fun experience of this class, then you can watch the YouTube channel instead of watching something else. You can switch to something. But anyway, it's the Husserl Archives YouTube channel. You can find it on YouTube. And all of the lectures except the first lecture, which was just basically introduction, is there. So it's, and just the YouTube channel just is going to be where in the future other events that we organize at the Husserl Archives, lectures, workshops, and things like that will be posted on it. So it's launching the YouTube channel through this class. And of course, it's also interesting for those people who are taking the MOOC who are not physically in this class to have access to what you have been discussing and what we have been doing in this class. Okay, and then before the ultimately last, are there any questions on the final paper? So remember last week I took some time to just speak to you about the expectations, what you should think about, the kind of mindset you should have as you approach what to do, sort of roughly what I think makes a good paper as much as it can be described. But are there any questions, or just to give this opportunity for any questions, or on the paper, everyone's hard at work, busy, deep in the
sort of
head.
a simple logistics question. The reason why this course is officially over in December is because we also have the MOOC, because all the other classes continue. Just wondering.
I've been 4 years in Belgium, I have no idea. I have no idea why. No one asked me. All of a sudden,
Suddenly you said,
I get a little thing saying, here's your class,
Sure.
here's the thing.
All right.
And it's one of those things you don't know who to talk to, because it's that's none has decided. So I have no idea why that's the case, because the MOOC is still going on.
Yeah, right.
We're in week 6 of the MOOC,
Right.
so beats the hell out of me. But so that's why we're having a class today nonetheless, and next week we'll have one. But yes, somebody decided at some point that the class officially ended, as I was told by Secretary actually last week. But I wasn't told about that till this week, so I have no idea. Okay, are there any other questions just on the class or class assignment or anything? Okay, so if not, then what I thought we would do today is, first again, let me sort of delineate the broad contours of what I thought we would discuss and do, juggle in a sense today. And also, it's one of the great paradoxes of a seminar or a lecture class that the complexity and the sophistication develops over time. And right at the moment where we start to get to very interesting place in the class where there's, we've read a lot of different things, we can make a lot of interesting contrast, then of course the semester ends. And that's unfortunately the tragedy of every philosophy class. Just at the moment where it's interesting, it's over. But what I thought we would do today is first begin by sort of bringing to a close the discussion that we sort of launched into last time, and I tried to show you the tremendous sophistication, the complexity in the impact of the war on Husserl, which is registered almost like an iceberg. You just see the tip of that in this, in these Fichte lectures, and the transformation that the war starts to provoke in Husserl's own thinking about ethics, a transformation which is invisible and still remains invisible because, as I already mentioned, most of this occurs in Husserl's letters and writings, which he at the time never published and which have only recently been published as of last year. So, in a sense, we're a bit handicapped, or you're a bit handicapped, because first, unless you can read German, and unless you want to run to the library tomorrow and get the Husserliana Grenzprobleme, you have no direct access to this, so you're just relying on me telling you this. But the reason why I want to spend time is because Husserl is a great example of the tremendous complexity of how the First World War affected a philosopher, which of course is one of the main topics of our interest in this semester. And this complexity, as I tried to suggest and we talked about, is registered at sort of different levels of Husserl's identity. So his identity as the professor of philosophy, his identity as a father of sons, one of whom is killed, his identity as a philosopher, his identity as a German, etc. And the point that I simply want to suggest, because again, you yourself can't read this unless you read German and start delving into it, but this is just to make you curious, is that, and we'll continue our discussion about that today and sort of see if you have any questions and discussions, is that Husserl starts to rethink the very nature of how he's going to think about ethics. He's going to introduce this idea of absolute value, which I very quickly introduced last time. We can spend more time, or I can spend more time explaining it. And it then formulates for him a kind of paradox, or what he himself calls a tragedy, which is where we left off last time. And I can read some more. If you look at his letters and manuscripts, especially in the 20s, you can see he's really obsessed with this thing about, it's an absolute value to love, for a mother to love her son. And that's the example that recurs in his thinking. And it's also an absolute value on his reckoning, and of course that's the interesting question, of love for the fatherland. And then the First World War formulates quite poignantly for him, both philosophically and personally, the conflict between the absolute duty and love for the son is in conflict with the absolute duty and love for the fatherland. And one cannot reconcile the absoluteness of these two values. So what I wanted now, as I mentioned, you can't read this from the Fichte text because it's like an iceberg, it's underneath it. But what you can see in the Fichte text is this. Again, you have to know how to see it as well, because if you just read it, not knowing Husserl's thinking, you don't see it. That he introduces this notion of absolute value, what he calls eternal values, and the way in which they have to be individuated. I'll come back to this in a moment. It's actually philosophically quite important that the value, though in one sense universal, and it's in principle a value for anyone, their love for their son. It's absolute, but it nonetheless has to be individuated. And that individuation is the individuation of the self who constitutes herself as an ethical subject by responding to the call of that value. That's how Husserl would describe it. And this will open up what he calls a higher morality. So what I'd like to do is sort of continue that a bit and just tell you more about it, also to make you curious, because it's really something that no one really understands and sees, this tremendous change of Husserl's thinking in his ethics that happens. And also, if you look at the standard way in which people think about Husserl as a philosopher, most of the standard entrenched images of Husserl completely ignore the centrality of ethics for Husserl. One always thinks, oh, Husserl is a Cartesian, it's about transcendental idealism. Of course, well, the Cartesian part isn't true, but the transcendental idealism part is true. But one doesn't see that for Husserl, the very impulse to do philosophy is ethical. And that ethics is actually central. And you can sort of see the genealogy of what is undoubtedly Husserl's most famous text is the crisis of the European sciences. Because you can see that the crisis of the European sciences, the text which is written in the context of the darkening of Europe under the Nazis, and the persecution of Husserl's Jewish origin, etc., has a direct connection to the First World War. You can see there's a very interesting argument that the First World War is not over in the 1930s. The First World War is continuing and has now taken an even more horrific kind of form. So that's why I thought it was important in the context, especially here, if you're here in Leuven, or here at the Husserl Archives, it's sort of a unique place to have an access to a sort of a way to think about Husserl that is not the commonplace. And also to see that it's quite directly tied to the First World War. So of course, in the context of our class, it's quite interesting. So what I'd like to do is take some time, your questions, your thoughts, I can say more about this, and sort of round off the discussion. Then make a transition, which is somewhat abrupt in one way, but we'll see in another way not, to Patočka. And there is where the complexity will become interesting, and I'll just mention it and I'll say more about it when we launch into it, given this MOOC. Because one of the things that's going to be quite interesting in Patočka, as you know from reading the text, is Patočka is the last philosopher who takes seriously the First World War as a philosophical problem. So the book, the Heretical Essays, as we know, was written in the 70s. In a sense, in my lifetime, of course I was not conscious of myself, because I was just a passing baby at the time, but in a sense it's in recent memory. And it's the last philosopher who sort of thinks that there's something quite important about the First World War from the point of view of a philosophical perspective, who tries to articulate what is philosophically important about the First World War, who, as I'll get into more detail, has this very striking claim that the First World War brings Europe to an end in a philosophical sense, and whose own interpretation of the First World War hangs on, in part, an interpretation of what he calls the frontline experience. And one of the things that, in the context of this class and the MOOC, and this is where I meant earlier that the complexity now, we're at a moment where we can see the tremendous complexity of the debate. One of the great debates among philosophers who think about the war is to take what was first a reality, namely this unique reality of combat in the First World War, trenches. When one thinks about the First World War, that's the first image that comes up, is an image of the frontline experience, and how this becomes something like a philosophical concept. And it becomes a philosophical concept that then different authors offer different interpretations of. And in the context of our class in the MOOC, the quite moving and haunting description of the gas attack in Malraux is a reflection on the frontline experience. As we'll see, Patočka is also going to be about the frontline experience in a different way. And we could plug in other authors as well. For our contrast, what's going to be interesting, and that's why I appeal, I hope you looked at the Malraux, looked at the video, because this will shadow a bit. There's a kind of similar kind of counterintuitive insight that from the utter humanity of war emerges the possibility of the true humanity. That's going to be Patočka's idea. That's also, if you remember in Malraux, the idea of the pity, that the true subject of war is not the enemy, but the pity of war. And also, in the most iconic poem of the First World War, L'autre de Corps Est. So this idea that the front line And again here, and that's why maybe today we can also have a much more elaborate discussion, because of course it's one way also to interpret Carl Schmitt, that the notion of the front line as a historical reality becomes a concept. Indeed, it becomes the concept of the political. This existential confrontation with the enemy. And that in Patočka and Malraux, though in two very different ways, and there are other authors we could also bring, but for our, this idea that from the inhumanity of the front emerges something like humanity itself. And the broader context of all of this, since we're now at the end of the class, is the general problem which unites Eucken, Husserl, though they have very different ways to think about it, but which Patočka will articulate with a certain crispness. So crisp, not Christmas. Getting infected by Christmas. Crisp. So crisp. With a certain crispness or sharpness, which he claims is one of the heretical essays that the idea that war gives us meaning. What he terms in the English translation, that war is meaning bestowal. Which is an English translation of a Czech term that he uses, which is itself a translation of a German term, Sinngebung. You may know there's a very famous book in the U.S., famous in the sense of popular culture, that was published a number of years ago. War is the force that gives us meaning. It's about the experience of war in the aftermath of Iraq and all that, by a guy called Chris Hedges. The expression, war is a force that gives us meaning, could easily be the way to translate the titles of just about every text that you've read, beginning with Eucken. Because Eucken's claim, remember, and we'll contrast Eucken with Patočka in a moment, is die sittliche Kraft des Krieges, i.e. war is a force that gives us meaning. Now, of course, it's going to be understood very differently than this guy Chris Hedges, but the fundamental debate, and we see this also with Husserl, so this is just to give you the larger perspective of the debate that we have been constructing in this class, is war the context in which something like morality, genuine morality, is created? What Husserl calls the higher Sittlichkeit. Such that war, for all of its destructiveness and horror and what have you, has nonetheless this kind of eschatological promissory horizon of humanity. And we'll see that, and I'm not suggesting that they all say the same thing, they say quite different things, but they're all obsessed or concerned with the same problem. And we'll see this when we contrast Eucken and Patočka and raise the question, and maybe you had this sense when you read Patočka, is Patočka an example of German Kriegsphilosophie? So when you read Patočka, you can ask yourself, is this a continuation of the genre of writing about the First World War that was created with Eucken? Because it seems to have the very same vocabulary. We'll see that it has the same strategy of those two concepts of war. The fact that he uses Elsioner, which we'll talk about. And so it's a very complex question, which allows us to make a distinction between Eucken and then to understand exactly what is this humanity that emerges from the front line. We can make a distinction with Malraux. So in a sense, that's what I meant when I said, now we're entering a moment in the class where we can see true complexity. Because one way to try to understand exactly what Patočka is up to is to contrast him on the one hand with Malraux and on the other hand with Eucken. Through this idea of the front line experience as the experience of Sinngebung, and Sinngebung in an ethical sense. So that's just what I thought we would launch into when we look at Patočka. And since Patočka, as you know, is a very difficult writer because he uses his own vocabulary, also the book, as I mentioned in a little blurb welcoming everyone to the MOOC, the book was published illegally because he wasn't allowed to publish. So it's a really great example of what Leo Strauss calls, true political philosophy is a philosophy that can only exist in the context of censorship. Leo Strauss's famous claim in writing in The Art of Persecution. And that that therefore, when political philosophers write in the context of persecution, then they have to be very crafty about what they say, because there's real consequences with what you say, whereas Strauss's argument is that in a democracy of free speech, there's no consequences to what you say, philosophically. So in a sense, everyone wants to speak very clearly and plainly, because in a sense, no one is listening. But in the context of totalitarian regimes, everyone is listening. And therefore, if you want to say something philosophical, then you always run the risk of, in a sense, the Socratic risk of being put to death. So that's one of the reasons why the heretical essays, and especially the one about the First World War, you have to keep in mind this is written in communist, the height of communist Europe in the 70s, before it all starts coming apart in the 80s. After the Prague Spring, which thaws and doesn't go anywhere. And so it adds another level of hermeneutical complexity to reading the text and trying to understand exactly what it's trying to say, because even though it's about the First World War, it's about the 20th century, it's very much about the present in which it's written, which is communist Czechoslovakia. So we'll talk a bit about the complexity of reading the text. So this is just to give you the broad overview, and of course we won't be able to exhaust it today, but just to show you in a sense where you can find yourself philosophically in this class after having gone through these different authors, both here in the class and then in the MOOC, and to start in a sense really asking very complex questions to understand the relations between these different attempts to reflect on the First World War, and also from different perspectives. I mean, Malraux is a Second World War French resistance fighter, Patočka is the dissident Czech philosopher, and Eugen is the prophet of Germany. Fichte reincarnated in the First World War, so they're also in very different positions. Okay, so that's just to give you a sweep of what we're going to do then when we launch into Patočka, to try to understand, is Patočka an example of Kriegsphilosophie by contrasting it with Eugen? And then what is Patočka's notion of the front line and the overcoming of the front line and the promise of a genuine humanity by contrasting it to Malraux? That's the strategy I thought we would do. Okay, so let's launch now back into, Husserl, and you wanted to say something.
Yeah, I had a question on the conflict between absolute values and the fact that it seems to be context or time dependent. Why do I say that? Because I can understand how in times of war there is this conflict between love for the fatherland on one hand, and then love for the child, the mother's love for the child on the other hand. I can see how it's valid in times of war, but once the war is over, and in the situation of Husserl, once the war is over, he lost his son, Germany lost the war, so I'm wondering to what extent we couldn't argue that this conflict is context or time dependent, as after the war, at the end, it could also have said, was it really worth fighting the war or sending my son to the war? And so I was wondering whether later on you wrote something on that aspect of the problem.
So, interesting question. Maybe what I'll do is take your question as an opportunity to recapitulate the notion of absolute value. Also because, again, as I said, you don't see it on the page unless you already know about it. And that's what's difficult about this text. And also I should just say, just to be clear, that Husserl's notion of absolute value is something that he starts to develop in the context of the First World War. It's actually not, but it's not simply caused by the First World War, because among Goethean phenomenologists and his students, there was an intense debate about ethics. So, like everything in Husserl, it doesn't have a single point of origin. And indeed, in Husserl's manuscripts and thinking about ethics before the war, there already are occurrences of the example of the sacrifice, the offer, and the example, and if you wanted to get into the minutiae, the example of the mother's love for the son is actually an example that other phenomenologists before the war already used. Moritz Geiger is the important one here. So this is just a kind of qualification that I don't want to overstate, that it's not that the First World War causes this, but the First World War is the context in which there's a kind of an acceleration of this concern. And again, the notion of absolute value, you can only see it if you know already about it. But if you look at the page, just to remind, I mean, the idea on page 126, and so I'm just going to repeat where we left off last time, is this critique of formalist Kantian ethics, at least in the way in which Husserl understands it. So Kant, the critique, again, of utilitarianism, consequentialism, and the idea that the notion of duty or Pflicht is always based in affectivity. So that's the crux of the critique against Kant. It's not respect for the rationality of the law. It's rather the affectivity of the law. And the affectivity of the law or the duty is the affectivity of the value that has the form of the duty. So there is a duty to love one's child. But that duty, so as we would say, there's a norm. If you have a child, then you're under the ethical obligation to love it. And that norm then commits you to certain ways of determining yourself. But this duty, according to Husserl, is not an empty duty, because there's, strictly speaking, no duty towards your child. There is, the value of that duty has to be based on love of the child. And that value, which according to Husserl is absolute, so in other terms categorical, is a value which is manifest through a specific form of affectivity. So that's the interesting idea, is that it's through affectivity that moral values are revealed. And it's on that basis that then they're cognitively apprehended. That's Husserl's argument. And that this then exercises a kind of demand, but again, as I mentioned, Husserl uses the language of a call. Or he says that, ich bin angerufen, it's very Levinasian, I'm called by the value. And it's quite important that it's the value that calls. So in that sense, it's unlike Levinas. It's not the face of the child that calls. It's the value that calls. So that's why it's a real axiology. However, that value manifests itself in the face of the child, if you have a ceremony. So it's the value that calls, and that value that structures, if you wish, if you want to be technical, the phenomenality of the child. And as I mentioned, when you look at your child, it's beautiful, etc. That's exactly Husserl's idea. And then now this value is also something that Husserl calls an idea. So here, if you look, I'm sort of decrypting the text for you, where he says that what affects, however, is on page 127, is not a formal or general empty command of duty, but it is the positive love of eternal values which offer to duty its specific content on each occasion. We'll come back to that, because you're right to emphasize that Husserl stresses that it's on its specific content on each occasion. So it's in that sense context burdened, if you wish. And it's specific, namely it's to me. It calls me. Now the value is in Husserl's language, and it's also Fichtean language, an idea. Now it's an idea in a very special sense. It's an idea because, in Husserl's thinking, that value, which has a kind of normative function, is the value that then I, as a subject, as a moral subject, use to determine and shape my own self. So the subject is striving to constitute itself as an ethical subject. In that sense, again, it's very Fichtean. The self is a project of self-constitution. And that self-constitution is one that is ethical insofar that it's determined by ethical values. And those ethical values are, in Husserl's sense, ideas because they function like regulative ideas for the shaping of the self. So what it means is that to be a mother is to be engaged in the project of constituting oneself as a mother, according to the values of what it is to be a good mother. And there will always be a gap between where I am in my life as a mother empirically and the full realization of what it is to be a mother. Because the full realization of what it is to be a mother, in Husserl's language, is an idea. And indeed, everyone fails at being a good mother, in the sense that there will always be some kind of gap between empirically my realization of the idea of being a good mother and the idea of being a good mother. So this is the sense in which, again, it's very Fichtean. For Husserl, the subject is an action, an activity, and that activity is fundamentally a history. It's a Tathandlung, and it has a history, because I have to continually strive at realizing what it is to be a self. In that sense, in his German, to be a self is an Aufgabe. So it's something that is given as something that has to be achieved. So it's a Gabe, it's given, but it's given, it has to be achieved, it's a task. It's a calling in that sense. And that's a sense in which there is a drive. So the subject is a drive to be itself, to become itself, and to constitute itself by realizing certain values which are absolute and ethical and which have a kind of rational, compelling normativity. And here I'll just mention it as a footnote because, again, in Husserl there's so many interesting ideas that are sort of wobbling, if you wish. The idea that reason is itself a drive. I won't go into it unless we want to talk about it, but this idea, which started to germinate here, becomes absolutely central to Husserl's argument in The Crisis, that reason is a drive. So it's an instinct. However, the difference between the drive, or he calls it trieb, there's a kind of drive of reason, and history is the unfolding of that drive. What's so unique about reason as a drive, as Husserl says in The Crisis, is that it's a drive without any determinate content. Unlike other drives, which have a determinate content. So if I have a sexual drive, sexual tweak, there's a determinate content. And so the history of Europe is the history of a drive to rationality where at no point do we know exactly what is the ultimate meaning or content of reason. So the history of reason is the attempt to find out what is the point of reason for human existence. And the crisis of Europe is precisely at that point where we think we know what is the value of reason for human existence, and we think we know in the context of a false conception of reason. So it's an absolutely fascinating idea that reason is a drive that doesn't know itself. And he's going to argue that Europe is this drive. That's what Europe is. The reason I tell you this is because we'll see that Patočka will pick up this Husserlian idea that Europe is an idea. It's a philosophical idea. And somewhat unlike Husserl, that project of Europe comes to an end with the First World War because, in a sense, the drive has gone silent. We are no longer driven by reason. We're driven by something else. And it's something which Husserl starts to think about in this context where he speaks of the subject as a drive, and that drive is the drive of reason itself. And this drive to be a self is to be a unified self. So constitution as self-constitution, to be a unified self. You may know who Christine Korsgaard is. Christine Korsgaard is one of the most important moral philosophers in the U.S. Kantian, kind of Kantian. She's a professor at Harvard, very important. She wrote a very interesting book about self-constitution. It's not Husserlian, but in one sense it's very similar to Husserl because she argues that what it is to be a moral self is to commit oneself to a process of bringing all of one's beliefs values into a consistent and unified whole. And so in a sense, and she goes back to Kant and also Fichte for this. She articulates it, of course, in a very modern vocabulary, contemporary moral philosophy. The intuition is exactly Husserl's intuition. That's what it is to be a self. The difference is that Husserl has a much more robust notion of values than Christine Korsgaard does. Christine Korsgaard is much more of a Kantian. It's about these norms that we're committed to. And once we're committed to these norms, we're committed for the sake of the norms. And then we try to achieve a life that's unified according to this self-regulation. Husserl, however, wants to take these Kantian norms and root them in values. But I mention this because it just shows you that there's something still quite contemporary about Husserl's argument about what it is to be a self. Now, to launch into your question, so this is the concept of the self that he's starting to put together. These absolute values are plural. There are many absolute values for Husserl, so there's just not one. Now, you may know that in Kant you have a similar problem, because in Kant there are many kinds of duties. And then Kant says that there's perfect duties and imperfect duties. And I can show that there's a relationship between perfect duties and imperfect duties. In Husserl, because he doesn't have that Kantian system, he has a similar problem, which is if there are different values, there's a plurality of values. Now, a plurality of absolute values. And what's even more complicated for Husserl is not only is there a plurality of absolute values, but the absolute values themselves are singular, truly individual. So he says this, just so you can see where in the text this is happening. He says this on page 128. He says, this type of the high moral person, so the high moral person is the person who strives for self-unification and to live a life in truth insofar that they realize values, absolute moral values, and these are pursued. So the type of high moral person encompasses a series of special types of ideal humanity, and that's what he means by ideal humanity. It's ideal. Who have a right in themselves, meaning they're absolute, and are not to be placed in the hierarchy of value. So these absolute values are not in the hierarchy of value. And this is for metaphysical reasons, which he interprets with a theological argument, which I'll put to the side. Not every human is an organ of the actual and possible unfolding for all ideas. And that's a really interesting argument. So, not every human being is structured by the possibility of being every kind of possible human being from an ethical point of view, is what it's saying. Rather, in each individual, God reveals himself, so the idea, in an individual way, and each of us has to correspond to his own idea. And then he talks about each has his own life dynamism, which is not really well translated, and that's why he puts it in German, Lebenstrieb, so drive. So the idea is that the values, if you wish, always have the specificity of the individual who is called by them and who responds to them. So this is, in a sense, the singularity of your calling. And what it is to be an ethical human being is to discover what is the true calling that determines you as a singular being. So this is the way in which it's not simply that there's no hierarchy, but the values themselves are individuated to the subject. And they're also individuated not simply to the subject, but to the context or the occasion in which they are revealed. So there's the kind of two levels of individuation, and this speaks exactly to your question. Not only that it's singular to me, but it's also the context, I don't know how to, the context or the occasion of the context. Meaning that under certain historical circumstances, certain possible absolute values will not be manifest or realized, because the occasion is not there in which there's a horizon for them to be realized. Now, the First World War for Husserl, of course, is going to be the alignment of a historical occasion and the specificity of a value in its subjects. So that's what's interesting about his concept of the war as an event. And as he argued, and I mentioned this last time, he says, look, the love of a mother for her son is absolute. And in one sense, one can accept that. I say grosso modo. The more controversial one, of course, for us is to say that the love of the fatherland is also absolute. So we have one absolute, another absolute. These cannot be placed in a hierarchy, so it's impossible to say one trumps the other. And yet, according to Husserl, so now we're getting to the heart of your question, in the occasion of the First World War, both of them are equally demanding. And when my son dies for the fatherland, the fact that my son dies for the fatherland does not vitiate or negate the absolute value of loving my son, which entails that I don't allow my son to die for the fatherland. And Husserl says that's the tension. And actually there's a thing where he says so this is in 1926 in one of the manuscripts, I'll read it in German. He says, für die Mutter ist ihr Kind, das ihr Krankheit und Tod entrissen, unersetzbar, so it's irreplaceable, it's absolute. Handelt es sich den Kampf nationale Selbsterhaltung, so it's now a matter of national self-preservation. Selbsterhaltung is, of course, the key term. So kann sie das Kind opfern, so she can sacrifice the child. Aber der Verlust ist doch unersetzlich, but the loss of it is still irremediable. So, unlike Eucken, and this is where you can see the fine nuances in the arguments of Eucken and Husserl. So remember that in Eucken, as we talked about, for Eucken, who also has this robust notion of sacrifice for the fatherland, the sacrifice for the fatherland would render the loss of the child, from the point of view of the love of the child, replaceable. It would cancel it. And in fact, Max Scheler, if you read Max Scheler's book on the genius of the German war, Max Scheler says that the highest duty of the German woman is to willingly offer her son. And then he has these things which are a bit crazy, where he says, that's the difference between us and the French. The French, their notion of sacrifice is not true. And it's too instrumental, they still have and he says very clearly, the Deutsche Frau, the Opferbereitschaft, he calls it. So the disposition, availability, preparedness to sacrifice the son for the fatherland, in a sense, cancels out and indeed trumps the love and duty that I have as a mother to make sure that my son doesn't kill. You might say that the absolute duty of a mother, and of course a father, to the son is that the mother dies first. And indeed, the tragedy of the death of the child, its unnaturalness, is that the child has died before I have. So in Eucken, you can see that in Eucken there's a kind of remorselessness. Because indeed, the absolute value of the fatherland is higher than the absolute value of the son. If we had more time, and in the MOOC I make a reference to this, you may know that there's a very famous German artist called Patočka. He's a sculptor, graphic artist, who lost her son in the First World War, her son called Paul, in 1916, or anyway, in the First World War. And in one of the few remaining German war cemeteries that exist in Belgium, because there's only 8 that remain consolidated. Where her son is buried, she has this amazing, it's quite moving, if you can go online, it's with Patočka, War Memorial German, First World War. She made these absolutely moving sculptures of two parents in mourning on their knees. So there are these stone sculptures that you can visit. I forget where they are exactly in Belgium. And there's these two parents in grief on their knees. And the whole point of Catecholovic, so this is the difference between Husserl and Eucken, is that actually Eucken says dying for the fatherland trumps the value of the love of the mother for the son. Husserl wants to say they're in a kind of tragic tension. And for Catecholovic, love for the son trumps love for the fatherland. So it's sort of almost the Wilfred Owen. Don't believe that old lie. It's a lie to say, oh, how wonderful it is to send my sons to die for freedom, for liberty, or something. So you have three different conceptions of the relationship between sacrifice, love of the son, between Catecholovic, Husserl, and Eucken. Now, the point, and I'll come to this because it's a really good question you ask. So for Husserl, as he says very clearly, the fact that the son has been, sacrificed for the fatherland is a positive thing, but nonetheless, the fact that I've allowed, or my son, still means that in a weird way, I'm morally culpable. Because that's what he means when he says it can't be replaced, it can't be trumped. And that's what he calls the tragedy, the tension. Now, for Husserl, the question is it the case that then after the war, to go to your question, because the context is different, that now we would say, like Catecholovic, look, it was crazy to ever think. I mean, this is what, Catecholovic is more sophisticated than what I'm saying, and she's a visual artist, so she doesn't say it, she shows it. It's crazy to think at any moment that, being proud that your son died for your country, that somehow is something to be proud of, and is something ethical. For her, it's absolutely madness, precisely because there's something unersetzbar about the love for the son, the love for the child. In Husserl's case, we could ask, why is that not the case once the occasion of the war is over? And that's because for Husserl, even though the value is manifest in history, and I'll put it this way, under a very specific historical circumstance, the First World War, once it has been revealed to history, it can't be undone. So in a sense, it has now been revealed that this is a value. So even though now, let's say at a certain point in time in the future, there is no longer a war, it's not the case that now love for the fatherland is less of an absolute value. And the reason is precisely because love for the fatherland is an absolute value, not a contingent value. Even though it can only be revealed or manifest in a particular occasion. It's structurally similar to his argument about Europe. There was no necessity for Europe to have been created. It had to be created as a philosophical idea under very contingent historical circumstances, which for Husserl, like every German, was Greece. But once it has been discovered, then even though we are in an occasion, which for Husserl is 1936, where we've completely forgotten about Europe as a genuine philosophical idea, or as we'll see from Patočka were alive today, in 2015 there isn't a Europe. For Patočka there's bureaucracy and nostalgia. There's no Europe. There's no veritable idea of Europe. So we're no longer in an occasion in which there would be something like the idea of Europe. But nonetheless, because it has already entered history, then it's something that we can only forget and avoid, but not know about, if you wish, or undo. So that's sort of a long answer, but I think it was worth to, because I think you asked a really important question about it's a really interesting question because you can see this very complex relationship between absolute value and history, the importance of contingency for the manifestation of absolute values, and how then, so one level is absolute value and history and contingency, so the occasion. The other is absolute value and the singularity of the subject. And so, in a sense, there's these two notions of singularity: the singularity of the moment, the occasion, the singularity of the subject. And just to repeat myself, even once we are no longer in the context of war, nonetheless, the value has been revealed. And so it doesn't lose any of its force. That's his argument. I mean, that's the argument he makes. So that's why you could say if you're not charitable, he has it both ways. He says, look, the First World War reveals to us, actually for Husserl probably was already in the 1813, the finals. The First World War reminds us. That's why the other thing that's quite important is the notion of Erneuerung. That different historical moments are moments of the renewal. The renewal, not of the value, but of our responsibility to the value, given that the value has already been revealed to history. And so you see that it's structurally similar to his argument in the European Crisis book. Because the European Crisis book is precisely that the crisis of Europe is the irresponsibility that Europe has to its own ideas. And that's why we need Besinnung. We need to come back to our senses as a way to come back to responsibility. Because the idea and the absolute value of Europe has already been revealed, if you wish. And that's why then the key notion is what Husserl calls Erneuerung. And if you're interested in this, the key texts that bridge this are what are known as the Kaiser articles. So in the early 20s, in 21 and 22, a Japanese philosophy journal called the Kaiser, which I think in Japanese means the present time or the moment or something like that. Because as you may know, that Husserl had a lot of Japanese students. Many Japanese philosophers came to study with Husserl, of course, with Heidegger as well. And so the journal had asked Husserl to reflect about culture and the aftermath of the First World War. So it's the first time that he starts to formulate his philosophy of culture and philosophy of history. And he writes 3 essays called 3 Essays about Renewal, über die Erneuerung. So the Kaiser essays from the early 20s, or 21, 22, the war, and then ultimately the crisis, which is written in the 1930s, there's a kind of development of Husserl's thinking. So that's the sense in which it can be both rooted to a context and an occasion, but nonetheless, it doesn't undermine the fact that they're absolute values. And that is precisely because the value is an idea. So it now is something that can structure and constitute, and if we are responsible to it.
Seems like further complexity might be the relationship of the individual to the varying occasions of his or her life. Because if the higher moral self strives for unity, then these new or renewed absolute values manifest themselves in different stages, then what does the individual mean to you? You need to incorporate them to you. How does that relationship function?
Yes, so and it's a really good question. Husserl doesn't use the word incorporation, but he uses the word absorption. So it's really, so you absorb the other. Yeah, not like a sponge. It has to have reflection, things like that. But he calls it an absorption of values. So in a sense, the values have to now become incorporated in your subjectivity, and your subjectivity, by incorporating the value, which is an idea, gives reality to the value. So it's a really interesting argument that different forms of life, different ethical forms of life, are different ways in which values become real. Now, the question is, if the value is something like a call, and this is a thing that Husserl, he describes not adequately because it's a very complex idea. It's a call that calls me and singles me out. So that's why he says and he uses a theological language here because he's talking about Fichte, but God manifests himself to me in an individual way. So everyone is called by God individual. Of course, there's a Protestant, vague Protestant theory back there of being appointed, being destined, predestination, though there's no theology anymore, it's just a language that's operating. But then the question is, okay, so first we would have to understand why this value calls me as opposed to that value. That could ultimately be inscrutable for Husserl. That could just be a purely metaphysical question. So for example, Husserl thinks that the philosopher is the response to a value of being a philosopher. So the philosopher is a hoof. But of course not everyone is called to be a philosopher. Now why Husserl was called to be a philosopher and not Fritz, that's a purely metaphysical question. That's absolutely inscrutable. So that's the first complicated question about how are these values distributed over subjects? Well, there's a lot of questions. The second one is, what if I think I am a philosopher? I'm a professor, people have deference to me, they call me philosopher, I have a YouTube channel, but it could be, once you're on YouTube then you're real. But it could be that actually, even though I think I'm a philosopher, I'm not. I could be a false philosopher, precisely because my motivations are for power, glory, money, and not truly to realize a value which is the value of humanity. So there's another complication about those of us who think that we are being called by a value. And Husserl gives examples of these, being an artist, being a politician. These are ethical projects for Husserl. It could be that actually none of us are philosophers. Because we haven't been called. And so in that sense, we're just bureaucrats. We manage a discourse, we go to conferences, we get money. That's not philosophy. And that's why, one of my favorite quote of Husserl is in the Cartesian Meditations, where he says, today we have, I would put it in modern American, tons of philosophy conferences, but no philosophers. So he says we have many conferences, a lot of activity, but no philosophy. So you can see that that's an interesting. And then the third thing, just because I think you touch on a problem that he doesn't work out systematically. The third thing is, what happens if I'm called, but I'm deaf to the call? Maybe my true calling is to be an artist. And Husserl does have some interesting reflections about this in his manuscripts, about what it means to be deaf to the call. And the moral responsibility that I have towards myself when I am deaf to the call. And here here one would have to interpret at this point, because Husserl again doesn't pursue it, but there could be this very Levinasian idea that no one by definition is deaf to the call. One has heard the call and one has decided not to hear it. Because that's the Levinasian argument, is that the call of the other, because it's absolute, is not a call that I cannot hear. I can only not hear it by having heard it. But the trauma of responding to it is so great that I prevent myself from that anxiety by not hearing. So in a sense, you can only not hear what you've already heard. And there's some indications that Husserl starts to go that way, to say, look, because the call is absolute and has called me, I cannot not have heard it. And so if I fail to heed the call, it's a kind of betrayal of myself, insofar that I have been called, but avoid the call. And the entire strategy of my life is precisely to avoid the call. In the sense, I won't get into this, but I'll say this if you grasp the reference, but you could say that in Shakespeare, King Lear, that King Lear, the whole strategy of King Lear is to avoid the call of Cordelia. And he avoids the call of Cordelia by making Cordelia flatter him, why do you love me, etc. And when she says, I say nothing, and he says, nothing comes from nothing, which again is wonderful, nothing comes from nothing, then the rage, I'm going to destroy you. Because the whole strategy up until the end is, I want to avoid what is there before me, which is the heart. So there's something, again, here I'm saying you have to interpret Husserl, because Husserl doesn't give enough. But there's a really interesting question, which is a deep philosophical question, of what does it mean not to hear? And how values are things that we first and foremost try to avoid in their absoluteness. That I take to be one of the main ideas indicated here. That the absoluteness of love is so threatening that we avoid it. And the cost of that avoidance is total chaos and destruction. So it's complicated. So that's the tragedy of it. So, again, I mean, like the first question, it's a very complex question in Husserl and a complex philosophical question. But you can see that, well, I can report to you that Husserl is constantly struggling with trying to understand, okay, what exactly does it mean to respond, to hear, to not to hear, why me? And these are things that, like, you know, Husserl's creative spirit, he's attentive to, but I would say he doesn't have a full theory in any sense. I mean, they're really open. Yes?
I was wondering, isn't there also a fourth possibility? What if you hear the call, which you called answer?
Yes, yeah. So I think, you know, one could, in a sense, one could have a whole class on the modalities of hearing and not hearing, the call modalities. Right? And I think you're absolutely right that, and again, in Husserl, there's sort of conceptual resources. So as far as I know, I don't think he entertains that possibility. I haven't read everything in Husserl. But there's ways, because in a sense, so you're absolutely right that there's also the problem that I can hear the call, but I'm not yet constituted enough to be able to respond to it. And in Husserl, what it is also to be a self is to be a structure of habitualities, which open and close certain structures of possibility. So indeed, if I hear a call, but I don't yet have a structure of possibilities, so there are certain things I cannot do because of who I am, then we would have this interesting thing that the call has called. I have the good intention, but I'm not capable. Right. And that I think is implicated as one of the modalities of this, how to understand the possible, in a sense, the possible incongruence between the call and the subject.
Yeah, because also when you're like dependent on circumstances, maybe you are capable of being a philosopher and you have the imagination and the brains, but you don't have the money.
Yeah, so for Husserl, it's not so much about the money, it's more about the brains. Because money for him is external. But yes, it may be that you don't have the intelligence, which again, it's also inscrutable. I mean, what constitutes philosophical intelligence is no one can describe that. Also, there's probably not one type. So again, in Husserl, you can see there's not one type. So I think it's a problem that can be formulated. Again, as far as I can see, Husserl never is attentive to that, but that's just, he's not attentive to it. Though, I'll just mention this with regard to the philosopher specifically, because the philosopher is a behoof, so it's a type that has an ideal that is tied to a value. That's why Husserl can say in the Crisis of the European Sciences that the philosopher is the functionary of humanity, which again sounds crazy for us to get wrong, because the philosopher is the functionary of humanity in the sense Husserl meant it, but Husserl can mean it because to be a philosopher is to realize an absolute value, which is tied to the realization of humanity. So humanity needs philosophers. For Husserl, absolutely. But with regard to the philosopher, Husserl does, and this is in his letters, and again that's why in Husserl, his letters are quite important. There's this one letter right at the end of the war where he invokes the Socratic notion of the daemon. You remember that that's how Patočka ends the heretical essay, the sixth heretical essay, where he says, well, he said I should have listened to my daemon. And what my daemon tells me is not anything positive, but negative. So the philosopher also has this other complication that not only is a problem of the behoof of the philosopher, the value, the capacities, whether indeed I can be, but then there's this other element in what constitutes the philosopher, which is the daemon, the Socratic daemon. And Husserl makes references to this quite often. And that's why in this letter he says, I never wrote Kriegsphilosophie because I listened to my daemon. Right. So that would be a further complication about the philosophical type of the person who is the philosopher. And it seems, as far as I can tell, that that's unique to the philosopher according to Husserl. that it has this Socratic theme. Which also, this will be the last thing I'll say, but again, I just want to show you that it's quite fascinating what's going on in Husserl. It also means that the center of gravity of what it is to be a philosopher is technically not in yourself, if you have this danger. I mean, that's the whole point of Socrates. That's why no self-respecting philosopher should accept praise. Because to accept praise is to say, I am at the center of the philosophy. I am the one who is philosophizing. That's why you could say the only true philosopher of the 20th century was Sartre. Because when Sartre was awarded the Nobel Prize, he said it's actually crazy. No self-respecting philosopher accepts the Nobel Prize. And he rejects it. So there's also this complicated thing where you see how in Husserl, like everything gets very wonky in the sense that it gets very complicated, and you realize it's not this rational philosopher who affirms reason. I mean, reason is it's almost like a Hegelian thing. It's a very cunning creature. But that's one of the implications of the idea that there is this daemon. Okay. Yes.
Well, I try to only continue with this discussion about the call. My primary question was, how do we know that everything calls us? So why do we know that the metaphysical structure of the reality contains such a calls which need the answers? But later on I was thinking about the supplementary question, how do we know that our response to the question, to the call is correct?
Yeah.
Who decided?
So I'll try. I mean, again, it's sort of the next logical question in our discussion. It's a great question. So I'll answer it on two levels. First, from within Husserl, and then just generally from a Husserlian point of view. Husserl himself recognizes that as a problem in a vague way, but never speaks to it directly. So there's a short answer. There is no Husserlian attempt to sort of create a theory or tackle that problem directly. He simply says it's a metaphysical problem, in which we have absolutely no insight. Now, so he recognizes it as you said, as a metaphysical problem, but precisely because it's a metaphysical problem, there is no way in which we can know. Later on, and here in the 1930s, again, things get very strange and interesting in Husserl, because Husserl starts to imagine the possibility of a rational theology. So again, it's quite amazing when you think of Husserl, no metaphysics, no, it's all about metaphysics. Because he says, look, there has to be a rational theology. And why is quite interesting, because he says, look, we have absolute values. But ultimately, if these aren't part of some coherent system of values, then it's quite difficult to know where the rationality is of these values. We humans have no insight into that. But you therefore rationally need the idea of God to harmonize all of these absolute values. As well as you need the idea of God, and here it's quite interesting that he goes back to a Kantian argument. Because if you don't harmonize all of these absolute values into some coherent system, then it's unclear why being moral would make you happy. So remember that this is the really interesting argument of Kant, that simply motivating oneself to be moral for the sake of morality makes you moral, but it doesn't make you happy. And in order to have the convergence or alignments of happiness and morality, you need, as a practical postulate of reason, the idea of God. So this is how, let's remember. And you need the idea of immortality. Remember, this is a very important argument of Kant in the second critique. Otherwise, you couldn't rationally frame the project of being ethical as synonymous with the project of being happy. Husserl takes the Kantian notion of God as a postulate of practical reason and uses it to solve this problem. And my suspicion, so here it's purely a suspicion. Sorry, I'm on shaky ground. My suspicion is that that would also be the device to speak directly to the question of why is it that this value calls me and not you? That's my suspicion. So again, Husserl doesn't, as far as I know, Husserl doesn't explicitly say that, but I think that would be the suspicion, that that's the way in which he would have to handle that, through this imagine, because he never works it out. He just says there has to be a rational theology. And again, if you're really curious about this, it's all in the principle in the manuscripts there. There's this big about rational theology, God, etc. But ultimately, that's I mean, you're absolutely right, it's a metaphysical question, which may be fundamentally inscrutable for us as human beings. So all we can describe from a philosophical point of view is the structure of the manifestation of those values. And the fact that, and then the question of whether I conform to them or not, who tells us that? For Husserl, that's probably both going to be a function of intersubjectivity, as well as my own ability to, be rational enough to be able to judge the distance between who I am and what I should be. So Husserl has this idea that much as he argues that the method of phenomenology is to perform an epoche, etc., he also says that to lead an ethical life is to constantly perform an ethical epoche on oneself. And the ethical epoche would precisely be to suspend my empirical self and ask myself, what is the true nature of the values that I'm trying to realize in order to measure the distance between my empirical self and the pure value, if you wish. So Husserl thinks that what it is to be a rational agent would be the ability to continually perform this epoche on oneself in order to judge whether indeed I am conforming in my empirical self to what it is that's demanded of me. But insofar that that ethical epoche also is inscribed in intersubjectivity, because in Husserl the subject is intersubjectively embedded, then there's also an intersubjective component. Namely, I don't know, I'll take a trivial example. If I'm telling you that I'm letting my 2-year-old watch Hong Kong horror movies, kung fu movies with a lot of fake blood, you probably would say, Lord, maybe that's not entailed in the absolute value of yours. There's something about the normativity that you're committed to in being a father that maybe that's at odds with, hiring the electric babysitter on television. So there's a way in which there's going to be this intersubjective discourse in which we're trying to calibrate each other. But ultimately, for Husserl, it's about my own self-responsibility, if I'm a rational agent. But ultimately, the fundamental metaphysical question is something which for Husserl seems to be absolutely inscrutable. We cannot know. Because that, in a sense, you can see it's really interesting. I'll go on because it's really, there's a kind of legacy of the problem of predestination. Because this is the classical theological problem of predestination. I have already been determined whether I will be saved or not. How do I know in my life whether it's worth being a good Christian if nothing that I do will change my salvation or not? Or is it the case that whatever I do does affect it? Because this is a tremendous theological debate in Christianity. In Husserl, it's the remnants of that theological problem. It's not truly theological, but you can see that it has that resonance, because it's the same kind of problem in structure at least. How do I know that I've been called to do this? Okay. Are there any other questions? Again, we can spend time on Husserl because again, we're in Leuven's Husserl archives, so that's what we do.
My question regards the relation between affectivity and the decision. I hear the call and I respond I decide upon a response which is always contingent and empirical or historically contextualized. My question is, because of the singularity of both of the value, me, and my context in which I'm trying to respond, does Husserl, or is there any place to reflective judgment? Because the situation is singular. I'm not given a universal beforehand, but I need to constitute in a sense that.
Yes. So the concept for decision that he uses, he has a kind of concept of Entschlossenheit. So more famous, more popular. So there is this idea that well, let me back up. It's complicated because Husserl has this sort of quite complex idea about there's an I, so in Husserl's language, there is the I that decides, there's the act of decision. But then there needs to be a decision to always maintain the decision for Husserl. So it's almost like proto-Sartre. That even if I decide not to be a gambler today, doesn't mean that tomorrow I've made that decision. So I have to continually repeat making the decision. So in a sense, I have to bind myself to the decision. So it's complicated because it's not simply the question of making the decision, but then it's what he calls in German the Bewahrung of the decision, the maintenance of the truth of the decision that I bind myself to, that itself requires something like a decision, a continual decision. But it's different than the decision that now I'm going to do this. So there's a complex notion of decision in Husserl's thinking. It's strictly speaking not a reflective judgment, but it is about the singularity of the value, which in Husserl's theory, Husserl thinks that the relationship between praxis, so acting, so volition, cognition, and affectivity, Husserl's thinking, generally speaking, is that a value, so if I want to know what should I do, the value of what I should do, don't kill your baby, has to be manifest and revealed in affectivity. And that has to be singular to, in the sense I have to have the affectivity of that value. So it's not simply the duty. On the basis of the apprehension of the value, I can formulate cognitively the proper goal. So because I apprehend my child as lovable, I can formulate the proper goal. Don't kill your child, or don't let your child watch horror movies. These are stupid examples. So the end has to be established through thinking, through cognition. On the basis of the apprehension of a value, that's his argument against Kant. It's not simply respect for the law, it's the value, in terms of which the law has this compelling force on it. And then on the basis of the cognition of defining for myself what is the proper end of action, what I should do, on the basis of the apprehension of value, then I can decide, let me do this, let me do A, B, and C to achieve this end. And this decision literally, so in a phenomenological sense, incorporates the value. And by incorporating the value, I self-incorporate myself into myself. So this is what he means by self-constitution. So in a way, I become the value that I act upon and maintain myself as the incorporation of that value. And this incorporation of that value is the means in which I incorporate myself into myself.
So it goes back to the maintaining the decision
Yes.
aspect of this.
So then you need what he calls Bewahrung. And this is the way, and then that's the way in which I literally become the value that I decide to act upon. And that's what he means, again, by absorption. So again, it's not like a sponge. And that's why then the theory of values is essential to his theory of self-constitution. So there's no self-constitution without this constitution of values. And then it means that then I have a proper attitude. Because also, the first story, you need Husserl's understanding of attitude. That the value places me in an attitude. And on the basis of that attitude, I have an orientation to the world that allows me to judge what are the proper ends of action. If I don't have that attitude, I'm not in a position to make that proper judgment. That's why it's technically not a reflective judgment. Because also it's based on a perception. I mean, once it's the most amazing thing. Husserl says, look, there's perception, like I perceive things, but the apprehension of values is not at the level of judgment, which is cognition, it's at the level of affectivity. And there it is something like a perception. And so he coins in German the notion of what he calls, so in German, perception is wahrnehmung. I perceive the chair, I perceive you. But then he coins his own term, he calls it Wertnehmen. And Wertnehmen is, I perceive the value, but it's not really a form of perception, because values aren't physical. And this apprehension is not a judgment from Husserl. It's very important that it's not a judgment. And also, it can be passive. So it's at the level, if you know Husserl, it's at the level of passive synthesis. Whereas judgment is at the level of active synthesis. So that's the
So what do you mean by absorption? Is that Wertnehmen or?
So I apprehend, the simple example, my child is apprehended as lovable. So if you want the Husserlian technical vocabulary, the value of the child as lovable is, in Husserl's language, a noematic characteristic. So it characterizes the manner in which the object appears to me. So I literally see my child as lovable. I want to squeeze it, hold it. That's my grandparents. So the value is not projected onto the object. The object manifests itself as lovable. In the same way that for Husserl, if I look at a doorknob, the doorknob manifests itself as terminal. So in modern analytic vocabulary, it's a structure of affordance. But it's a structure of value affordances. That is what Wertnehmen takes in. Then when, on the basis of that taking in, that my child is lovable, I'm able to formulate what are the proper ends of my action, and then act upon that, then I've absorbed the value. So again, absorb is a metaphor. I've absorbed it because maybe a better term is I've incorporated the value. And here, I think it's a deep insight. Again, I don't want to make this class on Husserl's ethics, but it shows you why people are committed to values in a way that they're willing to sacrifice themselves. Right? It goes back to the problem of sacrifice. Precisely because if who you are is, or are, I don't know what the proper English is, the values that you're committed to, then a threat against the values is a threat against yourself. That's why we identify ourselves with those values. And that's why, that's why the mother will throw herself in front of the car to save the baby. So you can see that in Husserl, though, again, I don't think he speaks to this example directly. But you can see that brings us back again to the problem of sacrifice. So to go back to your question, the first one I wanted, precisely because the mother, the German mother, has absorbed the value of the love for the fatherland. She has made that a principle of her self-constitution. And that's the reason why then she is bereit to sacrifice herself, her son, because she is that value. So the threat against the value is the threat against those who are invested and have become that value. And here I think when you see that, this is really central to the whole Kriegsphilosophie in Germany. Because so much of their argument, though it has different contours in Lake and in Husserl, is the war is a war of existence against us as a people. But what is the people? The people is the reality of its values. So the attack against us is the attack against the people, against the values. And those who would attack us and attack the values are barbarians. Different barbarians than today, but they're barbarians. That's the logic that's going on here. So that's why, and then Husserl has almost the intellectual, well, partially intellectual integrity, but also a system to see now there's a real problem. In a way that, as I suggested, Eucken cannot see. That there still is genuine loss and genuine mourning. So another way to put it is that there's genuine mourning and moral culpability for the death of my son, and at the same time, genuine patriotism. Those for Husserl, you cannot adjudicate one or the other. So you cannot say, well, stupid mother, don't be patriotic. Or you can't say, stupid mother, don't cry for your child. Rejoice that he is the hero of Germany. Both of those are closed by Husserl's thinking. And that's why, again, I think it's important to spend time on Husserl. You see the tremendous complexity that the problem of the First World War poses for him, and this almost irresolvable tension about the problem of sacrifice. Okay. If there's no, again, we can still, because again, it's philosophy, so in the Husserlian spirit, it's an infinite task, right? Because the ideal is infinite. But if there are no other questions or comments, then what I would suggest is that we take a short break, and then we launch into Patočka. And actually, we've established a lot of, the central, the thread that allows for the transition to Patočka is going to be the problem of sacrifice, as well as discerning the proper concept of war in order to understand the proper concept of sacrifice. We'll see that that's going to be also the strategy that structures Patočka's reflections in this historical lesson. So 10 minutes, is that good? So maybe the best way to proceed to now launch into once on something, I think it was quite different from Husserl, though, as already mentioned. And as you know, studying with Husserl, studying Heidegger, is to, I won't try to summarize the heretical essays. In the sense, the essays, of course, have to be read in sequence, but they're also somewhat self-contained. And what I will try to do is also explain some of the vocabulary, because it's, the logic of the day, the epoch of the night, is almost an allegorical language. And I think the text functions also in that way, for something allegorical about it. So, to sort of explain a bit the vocabulary, that's why I put some of the key terms, as well as the vocabulary gives expression to concepts in Patočka's thinking, Patočka's philosophical thinking. And to first begin with his diagnosis. So I'll just sort of, Patočka begins with a diagnosis of what is the proper interpretation of the First World War, and claims that all interpretations thus far have fallen short. And then his own attempt to interpret the war. And I'll try to show that there's actually at least two different concepts of war that are developed in his thinking that come into conflict in the war. Then we'll focus on the analysis of the frontline experience, which he uses in order to do a kind of phenomenology, if you wish, of that frontline experience. And by referring to the testimonies of two participants in the war, Tilla de Chardin and Ernst Jünger. De Chardin is probably less known to you than Ernst Jünger. And then sort of end up with just thinking about what's the point of that analysis, and the notion that of what he calls then at the end the solidarity of the shaken. As well as we'll talk about the difference he makes between what he calls relative sacrifice and absolute sacrifice. So that's sort of the landscape of what I thought we would talk about. And if you have questions, because again, the vocabulary is very distinctive to Patočka, and if you don't know Patočka, it takes a while to get used to the vocabulary, as well as, if you wish, his categories which he develops. Before we launch into that, let me just say a very general statement about the heretical essays and where this essay fits, because again, you have to understand something about it. The general argument for Patočka is to do, as he says, they're essays in the philosophy of history. And in one way, you can think of the heretical essays as rewriting Husserl's crisis. In fact, Patočka says in another text, he says, Husserl is the first philosopher who articulates Europe as a philosophical idea. So not as geography, not through nationality, but as a philosophical idea. He does this in the crisis. And in many regards, among other things, the heretical essays is doing many things. one clean way, so it's clear, is to read the heretical essays as rewriting Husserl's crisis. And rewriting Husserl's crisis, where the center of gravity of the crisis and of Europe and the idea of Europe is not so much the project of reason or rationality. So in Husserl's text, the crisis of the European sciences, by which he means rationality, but rather the crisis of a certain notion of the political. So it's not the crisis of reason, it's the crisis of the political. And a certain notion of the political which is inseparable from a certain notion of the self, or subjectivity, which Patočka will define, or not any definition, will characterize through this Platonic expression, the care of the soul, or the care of the self. So Patočka's basic idea is that contra Husserl, but in the spirit of Husserl, Europe is a philosophical project, so this language a philosophical idea, not the idea or project of reason, but the idea or project that has two inseparable components. One is what a certain notion of politics or the political, which he identifies with the Greek polis. And here, many interpreters of Patočka, especially today, want to read this as a kind of argument about democracy. There's something to it, there's something not to it. But if you want to make this a bit more tangible, it's about the idea of democracy. It's also very similar to Arendt's idea of the political. And actually, Patočka had read Arendt's The Human Condition. One way to read the heretical essays is a kind of interesting response to Arendt. So remember that in Arendt's The Human Condition is a similar idea, that I'm going to tell the history of the West as the crisis of the political. And the political first comes to genuine expression in Greece. So not work world, not labor, but the political, where the political is individuals who act in concert with each other. That's what Greece is. And then the history of the West is the colonization of the political through work, labor, the socialization of the political, which is her crisis of contemporary democracy. There's something like that in Patočka as well, though Patočka also is a different creature, but for the sake of just getting you into what Patočka is up to, that Europe is a certain notion of politics manifested in the idea of the Greek city-state, the polis. And that is connected to the idea of the self as a care for the self, as the attempt to define oneself in view of truth. So a life in truth. In a sense, these two ideas, that this is what Europe is, this is what philosophy is about, is a shorthand way to, in a sense, rewrite, in a very historical mode, Plato's Republic. Because remember that this is the fundamental argument of Plato. In order to ask what is justice, the first question, we have to ask what is the soul. But in order to understand the soul, we need to see the soul writ large, as Socrates says, and that's the polis. So an analysis of the polis is required for an analysis of the soul. An analysis of the soul is required for analysis of the polis. And both of them are understood as projects of a relationship to the whole. And the relationship to the whole is the question of justice, which is the question of truth. Which is ultimately the question of the good. Because as you'll remember, the most famous allegory or passage in the history of philosophy in the Republic, where they press Socrates and say, tell us what is the good, tell us what is the good. And Socrates says, I can only give it to you as an image, as an allegory, the famous allegory of the cave, that the good is the sun. So higher than being is the good. And what it means to be a self is to define oneself in pursuit of the good, and the just society is organized. So for Patočka, this is what Europe is. Europe is the project of the self, as what he calls the care of the self, the care of the soul. And this is both a conception of the subject, as well as a political conception And his argument is that this is what Europe is, this is why Europe begins with Greece, this is what Greece is, this is why philosophy has its origins in Europe. And then the whole history of Europe since the Greeks is, much like Arendt, the history of a forgetting, or a covering over. In Arendt, as you recall, it's the covering over of the in Patočka, it's the contamination, the deformation. I mean, the different ways you describe it, but basically it's the loss. It's not the Zeitvergessenheit, but it's the forgettingness of the political and the care of the soul. And he charts it through the two important phases in the history of the West, which is Christianity and then the rise of modern capitalism and then modernity. I'll leave out of my report the function of the problem of religion, which is very important, and Christianity and monotheism. Just for reasons of economy, and that makes things a little more complicated. But there's also a very important argument for Christianity and the philosophical contribution of Christianity to Europe. All of this then is the historical narrative that he develops from Essay 1 to Essay 6, then culminates with the Essay 6, which has the title Wars of the 20th Century as War. And there the argument is that the First World War is, it's almost a cliche, the original catastrophe of the 20th century. And it reveals something metaphysical about our relationship in the West to being. It's very influenced by Heidegger in that way. And the basic idea is that with World War I in the 20th century, it's precisely this idea of Europe that now comes to an end. For those of you who are interested in Arendt, I mean, it's quite fascinating to read Arendt and Patočka next to each other, because as you know, for Arendt, the event that brings Europe to an end is the Holocaust and totalitarianism. And then, this weird thing called democracy in the 50s, which is completely apolitical. So, the key event philosophically for a philosophy of history is the Second World War. And then this weird twilight of the Cold War. Patočka, who, as I said, had read Arendt and had really studied it, will say it's the First World War. So it's not so much an alternative, but it's an interesting debate about, if the 20th, what does the 20th century bring to an end from a philosophical point of view, and where does that end begin? That's the debate that they're having. And that's why in our context it's interesting, because it's clearly the First World War, not the Second World War. And if you want me to discuss this, it's an interesting problem, the almost near silence in Patočka, in the Heretical essays about the Second World War. There's one little reference, and really, from his point of view, it's the First World War, and the Second World War almost passes in silence, it's almost invisible in this text. So that's what then we land in the sixth essay, where there's going to be this attempt, as he says, to provide a philosophical interpretation of the First World War. That philosophical interpretation culminates a philosophy of history, which is fundamentally the history of the decline and the end of Europe. But then at the same time, and that's what's interesting about the essay, he's going to argue that while in the same gesture, the same motion, the First World War brings to an end Europe by, in a very Heideggerian way, revealing to us the metaphysical organization, if you wish, of our relationship to being, which is going to be heavily influenced in part by Heidegger's critique of the essence of modern metaphysics as technology. That at the same time, from within this experience of absolute catastrophe, there is the glimmer of hope, or the glimmer of an alternative horizon, which doesn't emerge or enter, if you wish, from outside the war, but actually emerges from within the war itself. So what's really complicated about the argument is that there's going to be two concepts of war. One is going to be the concept of war as the culmination of Western metaphysics. And for that, he will use the term that was popularized by Hans Jünger, though it was already coined in the First World War by sociologists. You remember that in Schmidt has a reference to this. Mobilmachung, totale Mobilmachung. So total mobilization. That will be a certain metaphysical revelation that the war shows us how, the metaphysical age of technology. But then at the same time, and that's why it's interesting that he takes Jünger. And of course, he knows that Jünger is often seen as the one who popularized the concept. But Jünger then reacts to this, if you wish, and he's going to pair off. We'll talk about it why he does this. Chaldin and Jünger. So let's call this one notion of war as total mobilization, totale Mobilmachung. Modern metaphysics, in a sense, has finally achieved itself in the First World War. And then there will be this other, and it's important that it's another experience. So it's important that it's an experience. In the real emphatic phenomenological sense, it's an erlebnis. So we might say not even a concept, but an erlebnis. It's an experience of a kind of another scene of the war, of another front. That experience, as we'll see, as you remember, has the structure of a conversion, because of religious, which then leads to the possibility that is not yet fulfilled of genuine humanity, of peace. And then the essay will end with the question, why is it that after the First World War and the revelation of the front has the possibility of a new humanity and a new form of peace that would allow us to overcome modern metaphysics, that this hasn't happened? And the essay, as you know, is very Socratic because it's completely aporetic. It just ends by saying, this is the question. So that's why it's a very elusive essay, because it really ends by saying, we can interpret how to interpret it, or we can think about it, but it ends with an aporia. And that aporia, again, is, in a sense, and here, if you remember in the video, in the MOOC, it's impossible to say anything about Patočka in 10 minutes. So I had to use a shorthand, if you noticed, by using a film, which is the film of Abel Gance. But Abel Gance is one of the great directors of French cinema in the 20s and 30s. And this image of the problem of homecoming. So the idea that, the First World War, we have sacrificed so much, so many people have died, the soldiers, but what was it for? Has it truly fundamentally transformed the world? Or has the First World War transformed nothing, but has merely confirmed what the world already is, or has become? And that's what's really interesting about Patočka, is that one way to read it is to say that the First World War hasn't changed anything from a metaphysical point of view. Precisely because the promise of a fundamental transformation of humanity that we thought would have been provoked by the war to end all wars has not ended war itself. So it's a very interesting argument that, in a sense, the First World War has changed nothing. I mean, from a metaphysical point of view, of course, 50 million people died, and it doesn't deny that. But from a metaphysical point of view, what he's saying in the 70s is that it hasn't changed it. And again, it's really important to read the radical essays of the 1970s before. On the other hand, it's going to be interesting that he takes this experience of the front allegiance, and he also takes these authors, Jünger and Chaldin, who have very clear political allegiances and cultural allegiances. So that's why it's such a confusing, not confusing, but it's a complex text, because it seems to use a certain discourse which has a very clear meaning. And then it also tries to do something with that discourse, which itself ends up being aporetic. And then, in a sense, it's the most elusive text that we're reading in this class in that regard. So that's to give you the lay of the land, that the analysis of the First World War, in a sense, is the capstone of his philosophy of history. The plot of Western history is Europe as a project that comes to an end. And the First World War then has that significance. It's the end of Europe. With the possibility of a Europe to come, which in 1970 has not yet been realized. So in another very nice essay that Patočka writes in German called Europa nach Europa, Europe and post-Europe. So we are in the situation today of post-Europe. Europe is gone, it's over. That's why I said from a Patočkan point of view, the European Union is a bureaucracy plus nostalgia. It's the nostalgia for something that doesn't exist anymore. Because it's purely about economics, bureaucracy. It's not about Plato's ideal of the life and truth. And it's also not a democracy from a Patočkan point of view. Okay, so that's just to give you the general structure of Patočka and how the analysis of the First World War fits into this, brings it to an aphoretic conclusion. And then why or how it's going to center on this plot between two concepts of war. And then this this figure of conversion, the war is conversion, and the idea that war is meaning restored. So there's something absolutely positive about the First World War. It is the possibility of new meaning for human existence. That's what he's going to think about in the frontline Leibniz, even though this possibility is, from the point of view of the writing of the Heretical, it's a possibility that has been shown but not yet realized. So that's what I called in the video the problem of homecoming. In English, the idiom to bring something home. I don't know if you, right? If I say you have to bring it back home, it means you have to actually show what was the positive consequence that changed things. So the war hasn't brought anything home. We have not brought the war back home, in a sense. It is how idiomatically that idea of homecoming using the idiom would work. Okay, and the key idea is that war is the bestowal of meaning, and the meaning in a very emphatic sense. Okay. That's the general argument, and it begins, so let's just follow the steps, and at any point, maybe we'll talk for like 20 minutes, and we can also continue this next time. At any point, again, we can talk about it, because I want to also make sure that if you have questions about the vocabulary, and also the course of argumentation, it moves very, it sort of moves with a kind of jerky movement, not that it's a jerk, of course, but jerky in the sense that all of a sudden you'll say something and then it'll release, and then you'll say something and it'll release. And it has this very allegorical language. It's almost in the tradition of Comenius. Comenius was a great Czech philosopher who wrote a very interesting book about the 30 Years' War in an allegorical style. And it also has this political sense. I cannot really say directly what I want to say because that bad stuff can happen. But what's really interesting is that he begins, if you remember, by saying that all explanations of the First World War fail to understand the true meaning of the war. So what he's saying is in 1973, 1974, we still yet don't understand the First World War. And again, it's interesting that he says this in the aftermath of the Second World War, because of course the Cold War is the continuation of the Second World War. So he wants to go back to the First World War and says, look, don't even worry about trying to understand the Second World War and the Cold War. You first have to start by realizing that we don't yet understand the First World War. And we don't understand the First World War because, and here he uses his language, all explanations of the First World War are, in Patočka's language, from the perspective of the logic of the day, which of course is very cryptic, and negative. So they're negative explanations. They're negative explanations because none of them recognize the meaning bestowal possibility, or war as a meaning bestowal. So the first idea is to say that we don't yet have the right concept of war from a philosophical point of view in order to understand the true meaning of the war. And if we did understand the true meaning of the war, we would understand that war is a force that has meaning. It's a sittliche Kraft. So that's why it's interesting to see that just at that opening of the text, there is an analogy there's an analogous gesture with Eucken. And here, since it's the end of the semester, maybe I'll put you on the spot. Does everyone remember how Eucken, sittliche Kraft des Krieges, how it starts? I'm testing you. Did you read the text or listen to my brilliant video? How does Eucken, so remember sittliche Kraft des Krieges, how does it start? Eucken starts by saying, war's bad, right? War's evil. We all know that. We know that war is an Übel, as it says in German, because war kills people, it destroys things, it undermines ethics and morality because people start to hate each other. So Eucken starts by saying, yes, war is not a positive force of movement. It's negative. It's an evil. But, right, that's only the case if we don't understand that there's another concept of war that in Germany calls in Gegensatz to it, in opposition to it, in contrast to it. And if we understand the characteristics of this other war, then we come to understand what kind of war it is that we are fighting. So in Patočka you have the same gesture, because he says, look, all of the interpretations of war, which are, in his language, from the logic of the day, is basically the idea that the First World War is negative. It was destructive, it killed people, it was a moral harm, etc., etc. And more philosophically interesting, it was an explanation or a concept of war in terms of economics or politics. It's also something that, if you remember, Eucken says very clearly. He says, the first concept of war is one where the motive for war is economics, politics, greed, etc. And it's in that context that we can ask whether a war is just or not. But, he says, we have to understand what is the true character of the war that we are fighting now. And it's really an amazing moment. He's saying, this war is not about politics. This war is not about economics. It's about something else. It's about ethics. And once we see that, then we realize that the war is a positive. It's a meaning bestowal, i.e. it has a sittliche Kraft. Now, of course, in the context of Eucken, it's a very shrewd move because it's trying to have it both ways. It's trying to say, look, this war is not really about politics, and therefore we can't say that the war is evil. So, yes, we destroyed the building, but that's not the war we're really fighting. You have to see how in a weird way, it's sophisticated, the argument. It's psychologically very compelling. That's not really the war we're fighting. We're fighting another war. So us Germans are fighting another war. So all of this attack that we're barbarians, that Bergson, who I met in 1912 and had a very pleasant dinner with in Colombia, because Bergson and Eucken knew each other, actually thought that their philosophies were very similar. The problem with Bergson is that he doesn't really understand what kind of war we're fighting. And he doesn't understand it because his notion of war, and the war that he thinks he's fighting, is not the war that we're fighting. We're fighting another war. It's on another plane, another front. Patočka has the similar gesture, though then it becomes very different. But I just want to show you that it's a similar gesture because he's going to say the logic of the day is any concept of war understood through politics or economics. So Clausewitzian conception of war. This fails to understand what the First World War was really about. In order to do that, we need another conception. We need to understand a different notion of war. A notion of war that is more, in his term, philosophical, and one where there's true meaning bestowal. Now, the concept here is going to be different than Eucken's, but at least the gesture is very similar. And it's even interesting, I won't go into this, but you'll remember that if you're very attentive to the text, Patočka says something about why Germany was revolutionary. So he kind of says, well, Germans, they're not really responsible for the war, which is quite an amazing thing to say if you think about it. Especially you have to, I really want to, it's an amazing thing to say because you're in communist Eastern Europe, which is all about the victory over the Germans. And you're now saying they're not really responsible for the First World War. They had a special Sondermission. They were revolutionary. Yes, they were Prussified, but they had this other thing going for them. So it's interesting that he even says, is Germany really the ones who started the war? No, Germany had revolutionary potential. And that's where you can ask yourself, what really is Patočka saying about the First World War? That's where it becomes complicated politically. Especially since in the 50s and 60s, there was a tendency in the historiography of the First World War to put the full blame of the war on Germans. A very important German historian, Fichte, that really is the German militarism of the 19th century that leads to the First World War and that leads to the Second World War. And Patočka was probably aware of this tendency. Now historians have a more nuanced understanding of the First World War. It's not categorically just the Germans. It's much more complicated. But in the 50s and 60s, especially after the Second World War, where the perception of Nazi Germany had sort of percolated or manifested in the perception of the First World War, then it was clear that it's the Germans who are responsible. And Patočka is saying the Germans are not responsible, unambiguously. So it's really an interesting thing he says. So I'm going to show you what the true meaning of the war is by showing you that war can actually have this positive, almost, he doesn't use the word ethical, but it's about something like that bestows meaning and that renews. So it's the Husserlian idea of erneuerung that you also found in Husserl's lecture, right? Not und Tod are going to educate us. They're going to renew something about life. So that's what I mean, that it's an interesting question which I don't want to solve, but is this a form of Kriegsphilosophie? It seems to have a lot of the same patterns. Also that it ends with a kind of humanity, argument about humanity. Though in one sense, of course, he's not German, he's in a different context. So it's a very complicated question. So he's going to say, okay, I want to show you what is the true meaning of the war, and I'm going to do that through this analysis of what he calls the frontline experience. And the analysis of the frontline experience is then going to be connected to a conception of the war as the manifestation of the most advanced stage of Western metaphysics. So there's sort of this double thesis that the First World War is the culmination of Western metaphysics as the age of technology, with another interesting twist. And that it's in that context that there is another kind of war, another kind of front, another kind of experience, which allows us to glimpse the possibility of overcoming metaphysics. And you can see how this is very heavily indebted to Heidegger. So in a sense, the fundamental experience of the war is the experience of the culmination of nihilism, which is the expression of will to power and the age of technology. That's what the First World War is. And within that culmination of Western metaphysics as will to power, there is also the possibility of overcoming that. And the possibility of overcoming that is not an experience that is alternative to war. It's a very specific type of experience of the war itself. So it's within the culmination of Western metaphysics as war that the overcoming of metaphysics as war is promised. And again, if you want to talk about it, because it's a very complicated idea. And again, politically, it's not clear what it's saying. So that's why then he's going to speak of the war in two registers, through the idea of total mobilization, mechanization, mass anonymous death, everything that reflects sort of what he calls the logic of the day as the expression of nihilism as power in humanity. As well as, and this is different than from Heidegger, because it's not simply the manifestation of the age of technology of will to power. It's also the expression of what he's going to call the orgiastic. Now, the orgiastic is a Patočkian category that he introduces earlier when he thinks about religion. And he argues that what religion is monotheism, is religion is, in a sense, the responsibility and what he calls the victory or the triumph over something like the orgiastic. And the orgiastic it's almost this Dionysian sense of primitive experience of pagan religions to be unified with the whole. Because Patočka thinks that Western history, from a metaphysical point of view, is driven by two impulses. One is the attempt to arrive at fusion with the whole. So think back to the problem of what it is to be a self, and to take care of the self is to understand one's relationship to the whole. That's the problem of Plato. So we need to give the logos of the whole, which is the logos of the soul and the logos of the cosmos. That's one element, which he calls the orgiastic, which becomes contained through religion, through Christianity. Because Christianity introduces the idea that what it is to be a self is to have a relationship to a God who is absolute, but who is distant, with whom there is no fusion. And then the technology is the attempt to exercise power over the whole. So to dominate the whole. So not to have fusion with the whole, but in a sense to dominate. So this is the Heideggerian analysis of will to power, age of technology, etc., with his own idea of this almost, I think it's very Nietzschean, this Dionysian and the Apollonian. Both of these come to full expression in the First World War. And that's an interesting idea, that the First World War is this ambiguity of total mobilization, age of technology, industrialization, absolute destruction, which is the expression of a relationship to being in terms of power. But at the same time, absolutely primitive and orgiastic. So it's both the festival, the orgiastic festival, and the hyper-modern mobilization of technology. That's what the First World War, from a philosophical point of view, what Patočka reveals. And that's why he speaks about it in his language, between what he calls the logic of the day. So if you're Heideggerian, the will to power is to objectify everything and make it visible in order to exercise power over it. And the epoch of the night is precisely this sense of wanting to release oneself into the obliviousness of being fused with the whole. So the metaphysics for him is this oscillation between what he calls the logic of the day and the epoch of the night. And the First World War brings these two together in a new form of warfare, which is the First World War. So it's absolutely primitive and absolutely hyper-modern at the same time. And this is then the concept of war as what he calls total mobilization and as the culmination of Western metaphysics, which is then the end of Europe. It's the end of Europe because it completely obliterates the idea of the care of the soul as a soul or a self that defines itself with relation to an absolute which transcends it and which is not its power, and with which it does not want to become unified. So the Patočkian idea is that the Platonic idea of the good, and to define oneself in view of the good, is to define oneself in view of the whole, of that which transcends the whole, with neither wanting to become fused with it, nor wanting to exercise power over it. And then this has a political consequence, that you can see that for Patočka, total mobilization is totalitarianism, politically. And the orgiastic is democracy. So precisely, we reject the idea of just sort of individuals, almost in a Platonic sense, that are left to their appetites, to satisfy their appetites. So there's also this idea that the two forms of the Cold War, American consumer culture, which is all about appetites, and the orgiastic, with its military-industrial complex, which is all about total mobilmachung, and communism, which is also a configuration of totalitarianism and the orgiastic, that is already put into place with the First World War. So that's why he wants to go back to the First World War and not take his reference from the Second World War. And then it's in that context that he's going to say, but there were these two individuals who had this very special kind of experience within the war because they were soldiers. And that special kind of experience is another war. So another experience of war. And this experience that they have, which is a kind of transformative experience, opens the possibility of overcoming precisely the culmination of metaphysics that the First World War realizes. And that will be then the special truth of those who served. Because it's important that it's only those who served who have access. So the idea is that the care of the soul is only initially possible as an experience of transformation by those who served at the front. So it's not the philosopher, it's the soldier. It's not Socrates, it's the soldier. Now, of course, there are soldier philosophers in their own way, but it's very important that it's the soldier. And that will be then the front of this. Okay, so maybe any questions? I wanted to just summarize this idea of the war as total mobilization, as the fundamental culmination of Western nihilism and metaphysics, not just in a Heideggerian way, because there's this other element of what he calls the orgiastic, and how that defines the First World War philosophically, as well as sets up, if you wish, the 20th century. So that's why he says the 20th century as war is the 20th century. Because the whole 20th century is structured, or the structure of the 20th century is revealed in the First World War for Patočka. And of course he's thinking that 1917 is the key moment. Because 1917 is the beginning of the bifurcation of Europe into East and West. And at the center of that is Germany. That is lost. That's the legacy of the Cold War, is the loss of Germany as the center. That's why you can ask, what does he mean when he says Germany is revolutionary? And that the loss of Germany is the loss of Europe. Could be one way you could read it. So are there any questions or thoughts, or just about the text or the argument about this total mobilization, which again I went through fairly quickly. And then maybe what we'll do is we'll stop, and then we'll start next time with just the description of the Jung and the Shao-Down. Then I'll say a few things to anticipate what we could talk about, such that that will be a kind of heuristic to move the discussion along next time.
Well, just a comment, because his analysis is about large movements of people, of Europe, of civilization, so to speak. But his counter-argument is very individualized.
Yes.
And then his question at the end is really a question that can only be answered by individual people. Because his argument is it's transformative to an individual. Well, you need to have a million of them. Well, who have gone through that experience, and of course the front line, most of the people died. Yes. And there was only a few who transformed. Did they end up becoming heads of state?
Well, I think you raised a really fundamental question. I'll sort of parse it out a bit, and then next time we'll get into it. One is that it's very important that they're survivors.
Yeah.
Right. So it's about the function of the witness.
Yeah.
So not simply the individual who was transformed, because this is a structure of conversion, transformation, but that they are survivors. So you have a kind of theory of the transformation of the self, which you have to know it's the individual that he names. It's really about Edmund's experience. Whereas the idea of total mobilization is that war is not understood through the idea of experience. It's a machine, which, as you know, is a common representation of the First World War. It's just a machine. And in a sense, the individuality and the very experience of warfare is obliterated. It's something that if you read Junger, it's very important for Junger, that the soldier becomes the worker, the Arbeiter. If you go back to Eucken, to show you that Eucken is interesting, historically, I'm going to test, I should test cases in German. But you remember how Eucken describes the war. He calls it das Werk des Krieges, the work of war, and that sacrifice is itself a form of work. So it's not bilden, it's werken. So it has a complex relationship to wirken, and werk. It creates an object, which is a work. It's the worker. Because also in Huygens' earlier philosophy before the war, there's a whole idea about, we Germans shouldn't just be workers. We shouldn't just be going to the office and making money. We should be cultivated. We should have Innerlichkeit. So the whole problem for Huygens is how to reconcile a capitalist culture of work with true cultivation, which is Innerlichkeit. And the First World War is the fusion of Innerlichkeit and work. And in Patočka, this is a kind of way to speak about that. Anonymity, in the loss of individuality, and also loss of individual traits of heroism, of courage. It's not the Homeric soldier who's the hero. There are no heroes. And what's interesting is, the First World War is the first war that has the idea of the unknown soldier. The tomb of the unknown soldier doesn't exist as a cultural phenomenon before the First World War. That now the most venerated place of the war is not someone's name, it's anonymity itself. So the missing of the sun, or the Arc de Triomphe in Paris. If you go to the Arc de Triomphe in Paris, it's all about, it's a Napoleonic monument, but now it's about the First World War, and because they have the unknown soldier of the First World War. So it's about das Mann. And you're absolutely right that it's about these individuals. And here, I'll just say this, we can continue next time. You probably notice that they're individuals who one is German and one is French. So they're enemies. They're enemies who nonetheless have the same experience of transformation.
Really, that's really the key part of the text. Really.
Exactly. And that shared experience, unbeknownst to them, puts them in solidarity. So that's the argument that the individual experience opens up to a plural, the political. Because the key term is the idea of solidarity, of the shaken. So those who have been completely shattered by the war, and through that shattering have renewed or have experienced something of the renewal of meaning, then they form a kind of, you might say, well, if you're religious, it's the hidden church, the invisible church, i.e., it's the ecclesiastic community of those who have been transformed by an experience, who then would be the vanguard for the reconstitution of Europe.
Which is a pretty big thesis, really.
Yes, which is also, it's very complex to understand what to think about that thesis. And that this notion of solidarity, again, passes through a complete rupture with the attachments to values as they have been inherited by our culture, and puts us in a position, in a sense, to fundamentally renew the very meaning of value itself. So unlike the word solidarity, which is, from a Patočkian point, thrown irresponsibly around today, because everyone talks about solidarity, it's not the solidarity of the shaken. Because from a Patočkian point of view, the solidarity that people talk about today is the solidarity of the logic of the day. The solidarity of the shaken is precisely the community of those who have nothing in common, because they have lost it all. And that community of those who have nothing in common is the democracy to come, which should emerge from the First World War. But then the question is, why did it not happen? So the veterans come home. The veterans have a special bond to each other because of what they went through this experience. This should be culturally and politically absolutely transformative because they have witnessed the truth of war. Yet they come home and nothing has changed. In fact, from Patočka, things got worse because then you had the Second World War and you had the Cold War. So there's a way in which you can interpret this also more in this idea of the community of those who have nothing in common, who have gone through a kind of, and here the term, of course, means something very different for us today, but it's the Holocaust of the war. Because you may know that the most important French World War I testimony of the war that Patočka has an interesting polemic against is by a guy called Henri Barbus, called Le Feu. And Le Feu is the Holocaust. in the traditional pre-World War II sense of it's an experience of purification, which renews. So there is a kind of notion of the purifying fire of the war is absolutely destructive. It reveals to us a metaphysical nihilism, but at the same time, it has a function of catharsis. But the question is, after the war, we now see from the point of view of the 70s that catharsis never fully happened. And that's why then it has this aphoretic thing. And you can ask yourself whether then the Patočkian argument in 1970, is there any hope for us in Europe at the close of the 20th century? Or is there still the possibility of hope? And that's the really interesting ambiguity at the end of the essay about the problem of hope. Okay, but maybe we'll keep that in mind, and we'll jump into this and spend maybe 10, 15, 20 minutes thinking about this and think about the problem of hope, because that will be the indirect way to get into Rosenzweig, because of course Rosenzweig, the whole problem of the First World War is a way to rethink fundamentally, among other things, the question of redemption through a certain experience of death. Hence the book, Star of Redemption. So fundamentally, the problem of hope and redemption is central, though we'll see very different.
Excuse me.
Okay.
You mentioned a text by Arendt.
Arendt, yeah.
What was that called?
Human condition.
Human condition.
So not next Wednesday, again, I'll post this on Toledo, not Wednesday, but Thursday, the 10th, same time.